I'm Michael Pauley, and this is Faith in Politics. On this broadcast, we range from the soul to the state as we cultivate those virtues and explore those principles that help us live well as faithful Catholics in this great land.
Well, good day, everyone. I'm recording this show from my office in Rapid City. My co-host, Chris Moats, could not be here as he had another important obligation today. So I'll be doing this show without my wingman. But I think it's going to be a great episode because we have an interesting topic and a terrific guest, which I'll introduce in just a moment. It's a beautiful fall day, and I woke up this morning and went outside the house, and there was a crispness in the air. And, you know, I associate that feeling with so many different things. It's harvest time. The children are back in school and Halloween decorations are starting to go up. But for those of us who are political junkies, that crisp feeling in the air means there's an election in our near future. So this year, the election is on Tuesday, November 8th. And on today's episode, we're going to tackle the topic of Initiated Measure 27. And that, as many of our listeners know, is the measure that would legalize the possession, use, and distribution of marijuana. This is not the first time we've talked about this topic on Faith in Politics, but it's an important issue, and I've wanted to explore it from a number of different angles. And for some time, I've wanted to have somebody who can really tackle it from a law enforcement perspective. And today's guest is eminently qualified to do that. I'm happy to welcome to the program Pat West, who is a veteran law enforcement officer in South Dakota, and who was just this year elected to be the sheriff of Meade County. Pat, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Looking forward to visiting with you today.
Awesome. Well, maybe just to kick us off here today, obviously many folks who live out in West River, South Dakota are familiar with you, and many of them voted for you, I suppose, if they live in Meade County. But we do broadcast to a statewide audience. So for our listeners who aren't familiar with you, maybe you could just spend a couple of minutes talking about your law enforcement background and particularly maybe with an emphasis on your experience related to drug enforcement.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you for having me, Michael. This is again, my name is Pat West, and I am a 28-year law enforcement veteran. Began my law enforcement career in 1992 with the Deadwood Police Department. After working there for a brief stint, I went to work for the State Division of Criminal Investigation under the Attorney General's office. And I spent about 26 years working for the DCI. Primarily, when I first started, I got into the narcotics investigations, where I did a lot of undercover work in the Northern Hills and Western South Dakota, working drug investigations. And then later on, I got promoted and was a supervisor for approximately 16 years, where I supervised the violent crime unit along with the Unified Narcotics Enforcement Team unit, which was the drug unit, which was stationed out of Rapid City. So during that time frame, I was exposed to a lot of different crimes, and a lot of those crimes often associated with the drug world.
Okay. So that's a good segue for my next question. So as I mentioned, we have this Initiated Measure 27 on the ballot, which would legalize the sale and the use of marijuana. And one of the things that I've really become aware of as I've started to work on this issue is that most of the people who, including myself, who will be going into the voting booth and casting ballots on this measure, really don't have direct experience with marijuana. So the state of South Dakota has a report that they publish on drug use. And according to their data, 87% of South Dakotans haven't used marijuana in the last 12 months. And that's good news, obviously, but it also means that, as I said, the vast majority of people who are voting on this really don't live in the world of those people who regularly use marijuana. And as a leader in law enforcement, you encounter that world on a regular basis. So, I mean, just to start our discussion, give us like the 30,000-foot view of how you see marijuana use affecting those individuals who use it and also the broader society.
Right. And, that's a pretty interesting statistic. What people need to realize is this marijuana may only affect a certain amount of people individually that are using it. But what they need to realize is the overall scope of things is how it's going to affect not only the people that are using, but also close friends of those people, family, and ultimately the community, because it will affect everyone, especially if this thing passes. There's going to be a lot of people that, like you said, may not understand what it means or how it's going to affect them until potentially it could down the road, where an individual might be under the influence of marijuana, crash their vehicle, and either hurt you or a family member. Then all of a sudden it becomes really personal. So people need to understand when they go to the voting booth, November 8th, that they need to understand it's not only going to affect those individuals that are using, but it's going to affect the entire public.
Yeah. Well, one of the issues that I want to dive in with you is the connections between marijuana use and crime, because this is something where there's a lot of, I guess, conflicting data. People hear, conflicting signals about what's going on with marijuana and its connections to crime. So from your experience, unpack that a little bit for our listeners.
Sure. Well, statistically, again, it is shown across these other states that have legalized recreational marijuana that crime will increase. Now, what does that necessarily mean? Well, basically what I have seen is, again, how this affects individuals. You're going to have people that are using marijuana that are going to be less likely to want to work, that potentially are going to quit paying their bills, may end up homeless. And then as a result of trying to fund that marijuana habit, they're going to resort to crime. And a lot of times we see different types of crime, whether it be violent crime and or property crimes, in which people are stealing things to fund their drug habit. So again, across the board, the statistics have shown that if marijuana becomes legal, crime will increase, not only that way, but also highway accidents, highway deaths, things like that are also going to be affected directly as a result of this.
Okay. So if you're just joining us, we're talking today with Pat West, who is the sheriff-elect of Meade County, and we're talking about Measure 27, which is the proposal on the November 8th election ballot to legalize marijuana for so-called recreational purposes in South Dakota. So you were talking about crime just a moment ago, and I want to kind of break that down into, well, I guess there's a number of different ways we could divide up the crime problem, but obviously, I think most people understandably are most concerned about violent crimes. So talk a little bit about your experience in terms of how you see marijuana connected with violent criminal episodes.
Right. Well, there's a couple different stories that I could share with you, and I'll share briefly. Number one, I remember a few years back, I received a phone call as part of my job as a supervisor with DCI. We were involved in investigating assaults against law enforcement. And I remember a few years back, I received a phone call of an officer, or actually a trooper out on the interstate, had been violently assaulted during a traffic stop that had occurred just outside of Rapid City. We responded to the scene and helped investigate this. And what had happened was the trooper had made a stop on a vehicle. I believe it was for speeding or something like that. Made contact with 3 occupants that were in the vehicle and could smell marijuana. As part of his investigation, he removed 3 of those individuals and conducted a search of the vehicle, and ultimately found approximately 50 pounds of marijuana that was in the trunk. Well, when he went to initiate the arrest on one of the individuals, this individual turned and punched him in the face, knocking him down, and then proceeded to severely beat him to the point where he was unconscious. The three individuals loaded up their marijuana, got back in their car, and took off and left this trooper for dead. And fortunately, somebody drove by and found the trooper, got him medical attention, but he was in the hospital for several months recovering, and it wasn't until a year later that he actually was able to get back out on the highway. So
Wow.
that's one example of just, the individuals that had the marijuana were looking at, some penitentiary time, but to go from that to then assaulting a trooper so bad to where they received an aggravated assault charge, it ended up going to the penitentiary for several years. I believe they got 40 years out of it. So one example. Another example I investigated, there were 4 individuals that were actually good friends that were living in the Northern Hills area. And three of them basically turned on the other one and ended up robbing him and stealing all of his personal items and his vehicle, and then ultimately taking him out into the hills area and killing him and left him. And I believe as a result of that, or the reason for that, these individuals had long-term use of marijuana and had been smoking marijuana for several years, and marijuana up to that point. And during the investigation, it all came back to the fact that their memory, I think, and their mind was distorted so much. Rather than, hey, stealing the guy's stuff and leaving him, they took it to a whole nother level where they ultimately ended up killing him, and then both ended up, or all 3 of them ended up going to the state penitentiary.
Yeah. Wow.
And Michael, that was like small amounts of marijuana, but I believe it was a long-term use that totally distorted what they thought was right and what they thought should be done.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure you've probably followed this, Pat, is that there's this growing body of evidence that shows a linkage between marijuana use and psychosis, but particularly amongst people who have schizophrenia, which is not an insignificant number of people in society. That when they're using marijuana, it can be a trigger for psychosis, which is obviously linked to episodes of extreme violence. Have you in your career seen actual episodes of psychosis or heard of it from other law enforcement?
Somewhat during some of our investigations, I've done, over 500 high-risk entries involving drugs and marijuana. And yes, we've seen it personally where we've had to address with people and they become extremely violent and they're fighting with law enforcement and they know that they're not going to have a chance, but they continue to fight until they finally get subdued. But yes, we've seen that on several occasions, and it's something that, I don't even think they realize what they're doing while they're doing it, so.
Yeah. So I want to just spend a moment talking about, nonviolent crime, like property theft and things of that nature that are connected to marijuana. What's been your experience with that?
Well, I think a lot of the nonviolent stuff, again, statistics from other states have proven that, recreational marijuana, once it becomes legal, there's going to be an increase in availability of that. There's going to be more use amongst the population, and there's going to be an increase in driving under the influence, as well as traffic deaths. Also, those individuals, again, are using marijuana and may not have the drive that non-users have and decide that they're not going to work anymore. And then a part of funding their drug habit is going to have to start stealing things. So they're going to steal property. They're going to pawn it. They're also going to be committing burglaries. So we have seen that as well. I've seen that in the drug investigation world firsthand, where people have needed to fund that habit. And that's the only outlet that they have, because their family has cut them off, because they're stealing from their family. So then they go and they start stealing from other people. So that property crimes is going to increase as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, if you're just joining us, we're talking with Pat West, who is the sheriff-elect of Meade County, talking about initiated Measure 27 on legalizing recreational marijuana. So we've been talking a lot about crime, and it's kind of a good segue to talk about one of the arguments that we hear from advocates of marijuana legalization. And I know you're familiar with this argument, Pat, but it basically, when you recount all of these horror stories about crime associated with marijuana, they say, yeah, that's why we need to legalize it. And the gist of their argument is that the reason we have all this crime is because the whole marijuana economy is driven underground. It's exclusively a black market. But if we bring that whole economy above ground, then we can, kind of make it neat and clean. We can issue permits for the people who grow marijuana, permits for those who sell it. There can be all these strict rules for how much you can possess and where you can legally use marijuana. And then, of course, they always throw this one in too, is that, when you legalize it, then you can tax it. And then government will get all of these revenues that we can then in turn use to give help and treatment to those people who are problem users of the drug. So I think to a lot of voters, this just sounds, kind of pragmatic, like, well, yeah, and one of their kind of, lines is that let's just treat marijuana like alcohol. We don't ban alcohol, we just tax it and regulate it. And so why shouldn't we do the same for marijuana? But I guess my question would be is that we have 19 states that have already gone down this road. And I'm just curious, what's your knowledge of how legalization has worked out in these 19 states?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. In these other states, the statistics have shown that legal marijuana grows as compared to illegal. There's 3 times more illegal marijuana grows that are popping up. And the reason that is because the amount of money that can be made in the black market. So if you think about the rule of economics, if you have way too much marijuana and not enough people that want to smoke it in your state, what are you going to do with it? You're going to ship it out of state and make more money. And that's what's happened. Like, for example, in Colorado, a majority of the marijuana that we find in South Dakota is marijuana that is grown illegally in Colorado. And some of it is legal, but they're shipping it out to Nebraska, Kansas, South Dakota, and they're making more money by distributing it on the black market side here. It increases gang activity. It increases your drug trafficking organizations, which are figuring out, hey, there can be money that can be made there, and we're going to take advantage of it. You have so many dispensaries or so many grow operations that are growing so much marijuana, it needs to go somewhere. And they're not going to put all that work into it and not make money on it. So I think you're just creating an avenue for that black market. And it has been proved in other states that is what's going to happen.
Yeah. Well, and again, from a law enforcement perspective, if you just come across somebody who's got marijuana, I mean, let's say that Measure 27 passes and we've decriminalized the marijuana. You don't know if somebody has that marijuana in their possession, whether they got it from a legitimate permitted dealer or whether they just got it from the black market. I mean, you have no way of knowing that unless you get some other evidence. Yeah,
that is true. In talking with law enforcement out of Colorado, I have a lot of good friends there, and that average Joe public doesn't know either. Okay, is this a legitimate marijuana growing operation as opposed to this one?
Right.
And just to throw something into that, Michael, not to get too far off this, but in IM 27, they're saying that each an individual can grow 3 marijuana plants if there's not a dispensary in his jurisdiction, whatever that jurisdiction may be. Or you can grow up to 6 marijuana plants in a house, in an individual house. Now, a growing operation lasts 3 months from planting a seed until maturity, okay? And it's even shorter if you start cloning these marijuana plants. So what people need to realize is if you have 6 marijuana plants, they average anywhere from a pound up to 10 pounds, depending on how big the marijuana plant is. So let's say you just go for 1 pound. It's a marijuana plant that's 1 pound. You have 6 pounds every 3 months. That's 24 pounds of marijuana that you're going to grow one household in a year. So that just goes to show you, how are you going to know if it's legitimate or not? And it's going to be a big mess on trying to regulate and keep track of what's going on. And again, you're going to have an overmarket of marijuana, and they need to get rid of it. So they're going to start selling it illegally.
Yeah. And, I guess another factor too would be, when you talk about these tax revenues that everyone says we're going to get from legalizing marijuana, well, an incentive for staying in the black market is you don't have to pay those taxes,
Very good point. Yes.
You're going to make more profits that way. So,
yes.
I want to dive into another issue here that gets talked about a lot with marijuana. So, and that's the whole issue of, is marijuana a gateway drug that leads to a greater propensity of people to start using even more toxic substances like heroin or cocaine or whatever? And the people who are backing marijuana legalization just hotly deny this, just say that the whole gateway drug thing is a myth, that's just rubbish, just a scare tactic to try to convince people that marijuana legalization is going to lead to all of this. It's going to open this Pandora's box to all these other drug problems. So I just, what does Sheriff Pat West say? Is marijuana a gateway drug or not?
Yes, I think it is. And this is the reason why I believe that. I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds I've been involved in over 1,000 of interviews with people. And majority of those interviews, individuals that I've talked to, I cannot remember anyone that has told me that they have used methamphetamine or heroin or a really bad illicit drug and not started with marijuana first. Now,
wow.
there are people that I'm sure that smoke marijuana that have not gone to that level. But Midwest HIDA just released some statistics that shows ages 14 to 18, if those individuals use marijuana, they are 26 times more likely to use another illicit drug after they've tried marijuana. So when people tell me it's not a gateway drug, I say, you don't have any statistics to say that. I do, because I've interviewed several hundreds of people that have said, oh no, I started with marijuana first and then I moved in, because I didn't just jump into the heroin market or jump into the methamphetamine market. That didn't happen. So the statistics that I have are firsthand, real life stuff. And that's why I believe that.
Yeah. And what was the study that you just cited about
the Midwest HIDA report would have been
and HIDA, just for our listeners who not familiar with the acronym, what does HIDA mean?
That would be the high intensity drug trafficking area.
Okay.
So that would be South Dakota, Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado, and there's one other. I don't remember what it is, but it's a group of states in the Midwest corridor.
Okay.
That statistic came from them on their study. Yes.
Okay. So they're kind of collaborating on data sharing to come up with a regional perspective on the drug use, right?
Yes, sir. Yep.
Yeah.
And it's a law enforcement document. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So I want to skip back to the talking a little bit more about the crime that it seems like one of the interesting facets of this whole legalization debate is that, you've got some crime increase that's the result of just what people are doing when they're under the influence of marijuana. It's impairing their judgment, which is then causing them to, to commit other crimes.
Mhm.
But then you've got the other aspect, which is, people who, they may not be under the influence of marijuana at that moment, but they're engaging in the petty theft and well, not necessarily petty theft, but just, theft and crime to support their drug habit. It really is kind of like a two sides of a coin, isn't it? In terms of the
Yes.
crime linkage.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, a lot of people, talk about that, all we're doing is just throwing people in jail for, misdemeanor marijuana and small amounts of marijuana. Well, that's not true. I mean,
Yeah.
people are getting citations for small amounts of marijuana where they have to pay the fine because there's a consequence. But, I've talked to several jails across the state of South Dakota, and a high percentage, I'm talking 90+% of the inmates that are in jail as a result of doing bad things while under the influence of marijuana and or other drugs. So they're not in there just specifically because of the drugs, but they're in there because of being under the influence while they were doing other things. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Yeah, I think so. So in other words, the picture that gets painted for us by the proponents of legalization is that our prison system is just jam-packed full of people who, had a couple of joints, in their car, and they were possessing small amounts of illegal marijuana, and they're rotting away in our prisons, simply for petty drug offenses. And what you're telling me is just that that's a myth.
Right.
Yeah.
And yeah, that is not the case. Like primarily when we, and still to this day, when the drug team in Rapid City they're working high level drug cases. And so we're not throwing people in jail just for small amounts. Again, we are going after the drug traffickers, the drug trafficking organizations that are doing that. And again, back to the jail thing, it's all those people are in there. Majority of them are in there because they were under the influence while doing other bad things.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right. Well, we are, for our folks who are listening to us on the radio, we unfortunately are coming up against our allotted time for the show, but we're going to continue the conversation with Pat West. And if you'd like to hear the whole conversation, we encourage you to visit the South Dakota Catholic Conference website. That's sdcatholicconference.org. And if you look in the top menu, there's a little thing that says podcasts, and you can listen to the whole conversation. But for our radio listening audience, thank you for joining us. And until next time, live well. All right. And for you lucky people who get the podcast instead of listening on the radio, we are going to continue our conversation with Pat West, Sheriff-elect of Meade County. So we were talking a little bit about the myth of, that our prisons are jam-packed with people who are there simply for petty drug offenses. And we've established that isn't really true. But I want to dive into another myth. I think it's a myth, at least based on the statistics, but let's unpack it a little bit. Is the proponents of this initiated Measure 27 say that it's not going to be a problem for young people using marijuana, because it's only legalized for those who are over the age of 21. And I guess I'd just like to know your sense of it, Pat. Do you take any comfort in the fact that it's only legalized for those over 21, or do you see this as being a problem for the youth as well?
Yeah, and to me, I put in my mind, it makes sense that if there is more marijuana that is accessible and available to the public, juveniles or underage people under the age of 21 are going to have access to that, and they're going to get it, and they're going to see older people using it. They're going to see maybe in some cases relatives or parents using it, and they're going to think it's going to be fine. And by having it legalized in the adult world, they believe that it should be something that they should be able to get a hold of, and they're going to do it. And again, I hate to keep going back to other states, but it's already been proven in other states that underage use under the age of 21 will increase if this becomes legal.
Yeah. And the, I mean, well, there's a number of problems with that, but obviously the key one is that a lot of the studies that have been done about marijuana's effect on the brain seems to indicate that the worst effects are amongst the young, when they're using it, that it really impairs normal brain development, lowers IQ. So yeah, we really have to worry about particularly, I mean, marijuana use is not good for anyone, but in particular, we need to worry about it when it's being used by young people whose brains are still developing.
Yes, sir.
So you've talked a little bit, Pat, about drugged drivers, people who are involved in traffic accidents because they're high on marijuana. And I want to dive a little bit more into that, because obviously this happens with alcohol too. We have a problem with drunk driving that, despite a lot of efforts to combat that, it does persist. But having said that, there's some unique difficulties, aren't there, when it comes to the issue of how you detect whether somebody's under the influence of marijuana when they're involved in an accident.
Sure. And the obvious sign would be you could smell the marijuana on them, but there are instances when you cannot smell that on an individual. So how do you determine what level of intoxication is this person? Now, we do have DREs or drug recognition experts out there that are able to determine that. But for example, if somebody smokes marijuana one time and has never done it before, smokes it one time, it could be, 3 or 4 days before that gets out of their system. Where if you have a person that smokes marijuana, has done it for several years, that's going to be in his system for 30, 45 days, if he were to stop using. So, when it comes to the blood tests and things like that, there's really no level established as to what level of intoxication is going to be tolerable as far as driving under the influence. They measure it in nanograms, how many nanograms of THC is in somebody's blood system. Well, they haven't determined on what level that's going to be. So, you may have smoked marijuana 4 hours earlier, you crash your car and kill somebody. Are you liable because of the marijuana you smoked 4 hours earlier? I believe that you are, but it's just one of those things that we need to figure that whole thing out. And I don't know if anybody's ever really addressed that yet.
Yeah. And I'm not trying to put words into your mouth here, but from a law enforcement perspective, I'm assuming that would be a real problem, right? Because when you're dealing with somebody under the influence of alcohol, you've got that objective standard under the law, of
Yes.
the 0.08.
0.08. Yep. 0.08.
Yeah. And so, if you have to stand in court, for this person's trial, all Pat West has to show is I did the breathalyzer test. Here's the results, Your Honor. This is the standard that's set under the law. It's objective. It's cut and dried.
Right.
Unless the defendant can come up with some argument for why your equipment was flawed or something like that, but at least you've got an objective standard to work around. But when you don't have an objective standard, I can't help but wonder whether that maybe disincentivizes some law enforcement people from even pressing that charge, because you have it's all about what you can prove in court, right?
Right. And if you have the marijuana, you have it in your possession, but now you're talking that it's in your body. So for example, now if you were to give a urinalysis and you tested positive for marijuana under the rule now, you'd be guilty of a violation. But there's no measurement. It just says there's marijuana in your system.
Yeah.
So what level, I don't know. So
yeah,
I mean, that's a good thing to discuss for future stuff too, is, if we legalize this, how's it going to be regulated? Because we need to have a good standard.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Um, I'm just thinking to myself here that for those listening to this show, if this show does nothing else, it ought to persuade people that there are way too many unanswered questions about the effects of this. You
Way
know,
too many unknowns on this deal. You are right.
exactly. It's fraught with complications that most ordinary people who will be voting on this ballot measure have not thought about sufficiently. And that's a good segue for another question I wanted to ask you about, which is this whole thing about we talk about smoking marijuana, but it's a much bigger thing than that. I mean, nowadays it's we've got these things, I guess they're marijuana edibles, brownies or cookies or whatnot, that are laced with THC, which we haven't talked about THC, but that's just the abbreviation for the long multi-syllable chemical name for the
You want me to
psychoactive
try it?
ingredient. Yeah,
It's
do you know it?
tetrahydrocannabinol.
There you go. There you go.
THC. That's what it
That
is. Yeah.
yeah, and that's why we're going to say THC, because I will not be able to get that out without tripping over myself. So, but with these sort of food products, now we're taking the THC, extracting that from marijuana and putting it into these other edible substances. What are some of the complications that we can expect to see with that?
Yeah. The problem with that is there is no regulation on how much THC is infused into each one of those pieces of candy. For example, gummy bears. You have one gummy bear and you have others, and there's no regulation as to is there an equal amount in each one of those gummy bears. For example, another story about the dangers. Somebody takes an edible gummy bear and it goes into your belly, the system, it takes a while for it to react to your body. So they take another one and then they take a third one that may have way more infused THC in it than the first one. And as a result, you're having what you would call an overdose, or you've got way too much in your system, which falls into the psychosis problem and hallucinating and, being afraid for your life. And there are examples in Colorado where people have done that and they're jumping off third floor motel rooms because they just don't get it. They don't understand what's going on with their body. And, there was another statistic with Midwest Haida that was talking about the amount of poison center calls to try to deal with these overdoses of edibles. You've got kids accidentally taking some of these edibles that think they're really candy, and they put them in their mouth. Next thing you know, they're extremely sick or they're unconscious in some cases. So it is definitely a problem. And I kind of relate it to the fentanyl situation where I've dealt with that a little bit. Same thing is you've got a product that somebody's familiar with, and you infuse it with a chemical, and there's no regulation as to how much is in each one. You're going to have a disaster, and somebody's going to die as a result of it, and it's scary.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned increased calls to poison control centers, but also I believe this is data from Colorado. You can correct me if I'm wrong, that they saw a big spike in emergency room visits associated with marijuana use, and oftentimes it involves these edible products, because the concentration of the THC makes these things extremely toxic. So
yes, yeah, and the edibles and then the marijuana itself, it's just so much different now. The regular marijuana that is growing now is almost 30% THC, where back in the 70s it was 7 to 8%. And then the edibles is almost 90% infused in some cases, and it just becomes extremely unpredictable.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought that up, Pat, about the increased THC content, because if you'd asked me a year ago, do I think legalizing marijuana, is a good idea? I would have said, no, it's not nah, I don't think that's a good idea. But I honestly was not aware about the THC content of modern marijuana until just about 3 or 4 months ago, when I started doing a little bit more research. That just blew my mind, that the amount of the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana that produces the high, that amount has increased exponentially. And it seems to me that the danger that represents is that, I mentioned the 87% of South Dakotans who haven't used marijuana, at least in the last 12 months. And you can divide that group into sort of two subgroups. One subgroup is people like myself who've never used marijuana. I've just never had any curiosity about it whatsoever. But then you've got this other group that, I don't know what the numbers are, but it's probably pretty significant, which is people who, maybe use marijuana sporadically, as a teenager, maybe in college, they were at a party, they smoked a few joints, and they felt like, it wasn't really a big deal. It didn't have much effect on me. And that's the mindset that they're bringing into the voting booth with them in November. And what they don't realize is that the drug that they were using back in high school and college has very little resemblance to
Yes.
what's on the streets today. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. Not even close. These people that know how to grow this marijuana are experts at doing it, and they understand the type of seeds that they have, the fertilizer they use, the amount of water, the amount of light, and they have really made it to where they understand how to do it and get the most potent marijuana that they can possible. And which is the difference between growing marijuana outside in the elements or growing indoor marijuana where you can control the environment. That indoor marijuana is going to be so much more potent, and that's where it becomes very, very dangerous for people.
Wow. Okay. Well, Pat, we are about out of time. I guess just in closing, do you have like a bottom line message that you'd like to convey to South Dakotans before they cast their ballots on Measure 27?
Absolutely. I've been investigating and fighting the war on marijuana for almost 30 years. I have seen firsthand what it does to juveniles, what it does to individuals and their family, and how much it devastates them. And it is important that people understand that the farther we get into this, the more difficult it's going to be on everybody in South Dakota. We cannot allow legal marijuana in South Dakota. If we do, we are going to have a big train wreck. And, I hate to say that, but people are going to say, man, if I'd have known what it was like, I wouldn't have voted for it. Let's not do that. Let's not do that. November 8th, let's vote no on Initiative Measure 27 and not let it in here.
Wow. Thank you so much, Pat. Thank you for joining us on the program today. Your insights, I think, are, they've certainly been illuminating to me, and I think they are for our listeners as well. Just in wrap up, as many of our regular listeners are aware, the Catholic bishops of South Dakota are in agreement with Sheriff West on this issue, and they've issued a statement urging Catholics and all South Dakota's citizens to research this issue, understand it, and vote no when it comes up on November 8th. And the South Dakota Catholic Conference has established a web page which contains a whole bunch of resources, some short videos, some informative articles. Many of these are targeted towards a Catholic audience, but many of them are not. And so whether you are Catholic or not, I encourage you to go visit that web page. There's a lot of great information. So that's sdcatholicconference.org. And then if you look in the top menu bar in the website, there's a little button that says issues. If you click on issues, you'll see the pull-down menu, and it'll say Vote No on Initiated Measure 27. You click on that, and there's a whole bunch of good resources that you can share with people that you go to church with, your coworkers, family members. And again, just get yourself informed on this issue, and vote no on Initiated Measure 27. That's all
Can
the
I
time.
do-
Oh, yep,
Can
absolutely.
I do one plug?
Yeah.
Now, I'm the law enforcement liaison for protecting South Dakota kids. We have a website that's available. So if people are inclined to go check it out, please do so. It gives a little bit of details of what our group is about and why we are trying to defeat this measure, IM 27. So please check it out. Law enforcement is behind it. They understand it better than anybody. And if we can convince everybody to get to the polls and vote no, we're going to be in better shape. So, Michael, thank you for having me. I appreciate you being here. Appreciate you allowing me to be here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that very much. And thank you for putting in that plug for the Protecting South Dakota Kids. I had that on my menu to do, and I didn't do that. So the website is protecting sdkids.com, protectingsdkids.com. And there's, you can read all about the issue, and also, make a donation if you're so willing to help, fund this campaign to educate South Dakotans about the dangers of this measure. So that's all the time we have. Thanks everybody for listening. And until next time, live well.